Marlena Crow didn't whisper. That was the thing people always got wrong about her. She didn't lean in close and murmur behind her hand, like a woman who understood she was doing something shameful. She spoke at full volume, in broad daylight, standing at the well where 4 other women were filling their buckets, and she said it like she was reading from a deed of ownership. That woman is going to poison someone's child before the season is out. She wasn't looking at Elowen when she said it. She was looking at the other women, watching their faces, checking to see if the words had landed where she'd thrown them. And they had. Every one of those women turned toward the road, where Elowen Hartley was walking home with a basket of nettles and lamb's quarters piled against her hip, her boots muddy to the ankle, her hair coming loose from its braid, and not a single care in the world about what any of them thought of her. Marlena let the silence stretch exactly as long as she needed it to. Thomas Pierce has been feverish for 3 days, she added. 3 days. And what has he been eating? Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. If you had been standing at that well, if that had been your child, your neighbor, your valley, what would you have done? This is the story of Elowen Hartley. Subscribe to this channel and follow her story all the way to the end, because what happens next will surprise you. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Elowen had known since early spring that something was wrong with the valley, but she hadn't known how to say it in a way that wouldn't make Silas set down his fork and look at her, the way he sometimes did, patient, careful, the way you looked at someone you loved, who occasionally said things that didn't quite connect to the world everyone else was living in. So she hadn't said anything, not directly. She'd said, "The creek toads are gone." Silas had said, "Toads move around." She'd said, "Not like this, not all at once." He'd gone back to his supper. She hadn't pushed it. That was the agreement they'd worked out over 11 years of marriage, not a spoken agreement, not something they'd ever sat down and negotiated, but an understanding that had settled between them the way silt settles to the bottom of still water. Silas worked the land. Elowen kept the house. When she went to the creek in the mornings, he didn't complain, even though she knew the neighbors talked. When she came back with muddy boots and a basket full of plants that didn't look like anything anyone in Ash Hollow would put on a table, he didn't ask questions. He trusted her enough not to ask, and she trusted him enough not to push when he wasn't ready to hear. It was a workable arrangement. It just didn't account for the beetles. She'd noticed the birds first, back in April. The meadowlarks that usually nested in the tall grass along the south fence had moved on. She'd walked the fence line looking for their nests and found nothing, no eggs, no woven grass cups, no sign they'd been there at all. Then the toads. By May, the creek bank that usually hummed and chirped on warm evenings had gone quiet enough that she'd stood there one night just listening to the silence, her arms crossed over her chest, something cold settling into her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wild plants had told her the rest. She'd been gathering along the creek for years longer than most people in the valley even knew. Since back before she and Silas had moved to Ash Hollow, since she'd learned it from her grandmother in the hill country, kneeling in the mud at 6 years old, and learning the difference between the plant that would feed you and the one that would hurt you. Her grandmother had a way of teaching that wasn't really teaching. She'd just crouch down and start talking. Not to Elowen exactly, more to the plant itself, describing what she saw, and Elowen had listened so hard she'd sometimes forgotten to breathe. That knowledge had never left her. It had just waited. By June, she'd noticed that certain plants along the creek were untouched. The lamb's quarters, the purslane, the wild onions, the nettles, all the things she'd been quietly harvesting, for years were growing thick and undisturbed. But the cultivated plants in the garden she walked past on her way to the creek were showing stress, too much of it. The leaves had a particular look she recognized, not drought, not disease, something eating at the roots in a way that hadn't reached the surface yet, but would. She'd tried once more with Silas. Mid-June, sitting on the porch after supper while the fireflies came up. "I think something's going to come through the valley," she said. Something that eats the gardens. He'd been quiet for a moment. What kind of something? I don't know exactly. But the signs are there. He'd looked at her, and she'd seen the thing she always saw in his face when she talked like this, not dismissal. Exactly. More like a door that was almost all the way open and then stopped. He wanted to believe her. He just didn't have the vocabulary for what she was telling him, and neither did she. Not really. Not in any language that would hold up in daylight. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. She hadn't known how to answer that, so she'd said nothing yet, and they'd watched the fireflies in silence until the dark came all the way down. Beetles arrived in August. She heard them before she saw them, a dry rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the air itself, a sound like nothing she'd ever heard and also exactly like the sound she'd been dreading since April. She was at the creek when it started, and she stood up straight and looked toward the valley and saw the sky over the east fields, moving in a way that sky didn't move, and she understood immediately what she was seeing. She picked up her basket and walked home fast without running, because running would panic Silas, and she needed him calm for what was coming. By the time she reached the house, the sound had changed. It had deepened, become something you felt in your chest, and when she looked back toward the Mercer place, and the Pierce place, and the long row of kitchen gardens that lined the road through the center of Ash Hollow, the air above them was dark and alive. Silas came out of the barn. He stood next to her, and they watched together, and for once he didn't say anything practical or grounding or slightly skeptical. He just watched with his jaw tight and his hands hanging at his sides. "How bad?" he said finally. "Bad," she said. She was right. Within 2 days, the cabbages were gone. Within 3, the potato plants had been stripped to bare stems sticking up out of the ground like accusations. Bean rows, squash vines, the kitchen herbs, the carefully tended beds of carrots and turnips and beets that families had been tending since May, all of it eaten or damaged past saving. The beetles didn't take everything in one pass. They moved through in waves, settling and feeding and moving on, and what they left behind was worse than bare ground because it still had the shape of a garden without any of the substance. Elowen watched people come out of their houses and stand in their ruined gardens and not know what to do with their hands. She knew that feeling. She'd felt it herself when she'd first come to Ash Hollow and tried to fit into the valley's idea of what a proper farmer's wife should look like, and failed at it in ways that were visible to everyone. She'd tried for the first 2 years. She'd planted the garden the way everyone else planted theirs, tended it the way they tended theirs, showed up to the community-preserving days and the church socials, and all the events that marked the rhythm of valley life. And none of it had felt right, not wrong, exactly, just slightly off, like wearing a coat that was the right size in one way and wrong in every other. The morning walks to the creek had started as something she did before anyone else was awake, a small private accommodation to the part of herself that didn't fit. Then they'd become necessary. Then they'd become the thing she organized the rest of her day around. The neighbors had noticed, of course. In a valley the size of Ash Hollow, everything was noticed. Ruth Bender had said, with the particular brand of kindness that was really just judgment, wearing a softer coat, "Elowen, don't you think those mornings might be better spent on your proper garden?" Silas worked so hard. Elowen had smiled and said, "Silas's garden is doing fine." It was. So her foraging hadn't replaced the kitchen garden. Silas tended it himself most mornings, quietly, without complaint, because that was who Silas was. But it hadn't helped matters that the neighbors couldn't quite categorize what Elowen did at the creek. And in Ash Hollow, what couldn't be categorized was generally treated as suspicious. She was too heavy for a farmer's wife. People thought, though no one said it to her face. She moved too slowly, too deliberately, as if she was always thinking about something else. She didn't gossip, which made other women uneasy. She didn't complain about her husband, which made them more uneasy. She ate things from the ground that decent people didn't eat, and she seemed perfectly content about it, and contentment in someone who wasn't living The way you thought they should be living was its own kind of offense. But now the gardens were gone, and Elowen had a basket full of lamb's quarters and purslane that she'd gathered that morning, and she stood at the edge of her yard and looked out at the valley and made a decision. She went to see Clara Pierce first, because Clara had 5 children and the least patience for pride of anyone in the valley, and Elowen figured if she could reach Clara, she could reach anyone. Clara was standing in her ruined bean rows when Elowen arrived, holding a stripped stem in her hand and staring at it like she expected it to offer some explanation. "Clara," Elowen said. Clara looked up. Her eyes were dry, but they had the particular flatness of a woman who had already done her crying somewhere private. "Elowen, I have food." Clara looked at the basket. "Weeds. It's lamb's quarters. It tastes like spinach if you cook it right. It grows all along the creek bank, and the beetles won't touch it because it's not what they came for." Elowen set the basket down and crouched beside it, pulling out a bunch of the plants, their leaves, still cool from the morning. "I have enough to feed your family tonight, and tomorrow I'll show you where to find more." Clara didn't move for a moment. She was a proud woman, not in a cruel way, in the way of someone who'd built everything she had with her own hands and wasn't accustomed to accepting help, because accepting help meant admitting you needed it. "It won't poison them," she said, not accusing, just asking. "No," Elowen said. "My grandmother fed me on this. I've been eating it for years." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her face, the pride giving way to something more practical, more honest. It was a mother first. Everything else came after. "Show me," she said. That afternoon, Elowen walked Clara and 2 other women, Dorothea Hall and Margaret Rowe, down to the creek bank, and she showed them what she'd been seeing for years: the lamb's quarters growing thick in the damp soil near the water's edge, the purslane spreading flat and succulent across the rocky ground, the wild onions pushing up in clusters wherever there was a little shade. The nettles, she showed them how to handle the nettles, how to use a cloth or a thick glove so they didn't sting, how the sting went away completely with any heat at all, blanching or cooking, or even just pouring boiling water over them. She showed them which plants were safe, which ones to leave alone, how to tell the difference. She was patient. She didn't talk down to them. She just moved through the knowledge the way her grandmother had moved through it, naming things, explaining, letting her hands show what her words couldn't quite catch. Dorothea Hall, who was 52 and had lived in the valley for 30 years, kept shaking her head as they walked, not in disagreement, in something closer to disbelief. "I've walked this creek bank my whole life," she said. "I never saw any of this." "You weren't looking for it," Elowen said. It wasn't a criticism. It was just the truth. By the end of the day, all 3 women had gone home with full baskets. That night, in 3 different houses in Ash Hollow, families ate something green and nourishing, for the first time since the beetles had come through. And the next morning, there were 6 women at the creek instead of 3. Silas watched all of this from a careful distance. He watched Elowen move through the valley with her basket and her patient explanations, watched the women's faces change from skeptical to uncertain to something quieter and more grateful, and he said nothing. But one evening, when she came home tired and sat down at the kitchen table, and he brought her a cup of water without her asking, she saw it in his face. The door that had been almost open had opened a little further. "You knew," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. I suspected," she said. "I didn't know how to tell you in a way you'd have been able to hear." He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, working something over inside himself, the way he worked at a problem with a piece of equipment methodically, without rushing. "You should have told me anyway," he said finally, "even if I wasn't ready." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Right, I should have." It wasn't a resolution. It was something harder and more real. 2 people sitting with a thing they'd gotten wrong about each other, and deciding to stay at the table anyway. Meanwhile, the valley was learning. Slowly, unevenly, with a great deal of reluctance and occasional disgust. Not everyone came to the creek. There were households where the men refused to let their families eat anything that hadn't been cultivated in a proper garden, who'd rather eat their stored beans down to nothing than accept food that a strange woman had found growing wild in the mud. Elowen didn't push those families. She kept the information available to whoever wanted it, and she let pride be its own teacher. But more came than didn't. And among those who came, something was beginning to change, not just in what they were eating, but in how they were thinking about the land they'd lived on for years without ever fully seeing it. A girl named Polly Mercer, who was 9 years old, and had her father Gideon's stubborn chin and her mother's sharp eyes, attached herself to Elowen one morning without asking permission and simply walked beside her, watching everything she did. Elowen didn't send her away. She just talked as she walked, the way her grandmother had talked to the plants. To the morning, to no one in particular, and Polly listened the way Elowen had listened at 6 years old, so hard she forgot to breathe. "How do you know which ones are safe?" Polly asked. "You learn the ones that are safe, and you stay with what you know," Elowen said. "You don't eat something because it looks all right. You eat it because you know it." Polly turned this over. "What if you're really hungry and you don't know? Then you find someone who does know," Elowen said. "What I'm here for." Polly thought about this. Then she said, "My father says you're strange." "Your father's not wrong," Elowen said. Polly laughed a sudden, surprised laugh, and Elowen smiled at the sound of it, because it was exactly the kind of laugh that made the morning worth being up for. What Elowen didn't know yet was that Gideon Mercer, Polly's father, had already told his wife privately that his family would not be relying on Elowen Hartley's creek plants, that there was something not right about a woman who spent her mornings grubbing in the mud while her husband worked. And he didn't want Polly spending time with her. What he also didn't know yet was that Polly had completely ignored this instruction, because Polly was 9 and curious, and her father's opinions, while noted, did not generally determine where her feet carried her. And what neither of them knew, what no one in Ash Hollow knew yet, though it was already in motion, was that Marlena Crow had been watching all of this very carefully, not with the eyes of someone who was afraid, or someone who was hungry, or someone who wanted to learn, with the eyes of someone who was measuring the distance between where she stood and where Elowen was standing, and finding the gap intolerable. Marlena Crow had been the authority on correct behavior in Ash Hollow for 20 years. She knew how things should be done, who should be consulted, what was proper and what wasn't. She had opinions about preserving and pickling and the correct way to run a community gathering, and those opinions had the weight of law in certain circles. She was not a cruel woman, exactly. She was a woman who had confused her certainty with expertise, and then spent 20 years building a life around that confusion until she could no longer see the difference. Elowen's quiet creekside lessons had drawn more people than any of Marlena's seasonal gatherings. That alone would have been bearable. But Elowen hadn't even tried. She hadn't organized anything. She hadn't announced herself, or campaigned for attention, or done any of the things you were supposed to do before you became someone people listened to. She'd just walked to the creek one morning with her basket and started talking, and the valley had turned toward her like a field of sunflowers turning toward light, and Marlena had felt it happen like a physical thing. She hadn't done anything yet. She was still watching, still measuring, still deciding. But the morning she heard that Thomas Pierce had come down with a fever, she understood that her moment had arrived. She walked to the well, and she opened her mouth, and she spoke at full volume. She did not whisper. The morning after Marlena spoke at the well, Elowen didn't know what had been said. She was already at the creek, before the sun was fully up, her basket over her arm, her boots sinking slightly into the soft bank where the water moved slow and brown around a bend in the channel. She was checking on a stand of nettles she'd been watching. For 2 weeks, they were nearly ready to harvest. Thick-stemmed and dark green, the kind that blanched down to something almost silky if you handled them right. She didn't know about Thomas Pierce's fever yet, either. She found out both things at the same time, which was worse than finding them out separately would have been. Ruth Bender was waiting at the edge of Elowen's yard when she came back from the creek, standing in the road with her hands clasped in front of her, in a way that meant she had something difficult to say and had been rehearsing how to say it. "Ruth," Elowen said. "You're up early. Thomas Pierce is sick," Ruth said. Then she stopped, and the pause was too long and had too much in it. Elowen set her basket down. "How sick? Feverish?" 3 days now." Ruth looked at her hands. "Marlena was at the well yesterday." She was saying another pause. Ruth was not a malicious woman. She was a careful woman who had spent her life trying not to make anyone angry and had developed a very precise sense of where the dangerous ground was. She was saying that Thomas had been eating the plants you taught Clara's children to gather. Elowen was quiet for a moment. The morning was cool, and the creek smell was still on her mud and green and water, and she stood with that smell around her and let the information settle. "The lamb's quarters don't cause fever," she said. "It wasn't defensive. It was just accurate." "I know you believe that," Ruth said. "I don't believe it. I know it." She picked up her basket. "How is Clara taking it?" "Clara doesn't know what to think. Scared. Thomas is her oldest." That was the part that hit. Not Marlena at the well. Not the rumors already moving through the valley like water, through a cracked dam. Clara not knowing what to think. Clara, who had stood in her ruined bean rows and let her pride go for 5 seconds and said, "Show me." Clara, who had trusted. Elowen went inside and put the nettles in water and sat at the kitchen table for a while without doing anything else. Silas came in from the barn and looked at her face and didn't ask. Poured himself coffee and sat across from her and waited. "Thomas Pierce has a fever," she said. "I heard Marlena saying it's the plants." Silas wrapped both hands around his cup. He had big hands, roughened from years of work, and he held the cup carefully, the way he held most things, like he understood. Things could break. "Is it?" She looked at him directly. "No." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. "What do you need?" That was Silas. Not "I believe you without question." Not "I'll fight whoever needs fighting." Just "What do you need?" It was, she'd come to understand over 11 years, the most reliable form of love she'd ever encountered. "I need to know how many families are going to stop coming to the creek," she said. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither of them did. By mid-morning, she had part of one. Dorothea Hall came to the door, not quite meeting Elowen's eyes, and said that her husband had heard about Thomas and had asked her to stay away from the creek gatherings. For now, just until things settled. She said it apologetically, which meant she didn't entirely agree with it, but she was going to do it anyway, because that was the way things were arranged in the Hall house. Elowen told her she understood. She didn't say anything else, because Dorothea didn't need anything else. She already felt bad enough, and making her feel worse wouldn't bring her back to the creek faster. She spent that afternoon going door to door, not to defend herself, but to check on the families who'd been gathering with her. She wanted to know who had food, who didn't, who was frightened enough to stop. She brought portions of what she'd harvested. That morning, the nettles, blanched and pressed and tied with a strip of cloth, the lamb's quarters dried and bundled, a small jar of preserved wild onion she'd put up the week before. She didn't announce herself as someone proving a point. She just showed up with food, the way women in the valley had always shown up with food when things were hard, and let that be what it was. At the row house, Margaret took the bundle through the door without a word, and her husband appeared behind her shoulder and looked at Elowen with a face that had already decided something. "We appreciate it," he said, in the tone of a man closing a transaction, "but we won't be needing it." Elowen nodded and moved on. At the Brennan place, old Ellen Brennan, 70 years old, lived alone, her husband dead. 12 years back, took the nettles and pressed Elowen's hand between both of hers and said, "You pay Marlena Crow no mind. That woman has been deciding things for this valley since before half these people arrived. And she's not always wrong, but she's not always right either." "Thomas is genuinely sick," Elowen said. "That's not nothing." "Children get sick," Ellen said. "My children got sick every season from something. Wasn't always someone's fault. But that was the thing about fear, it needed a cause. A fever with no explanation was frightening in one way. A fever with an explanation, even a wrong one, was frightening in a different way, but at least it gave you somewhere to put the feeling. Marlena had given the valley somewhere to put it, and that was worth more than accuracy in a moment like this. Elowen understood that. She didn't like it, but she understood it. She went to see Clara Pierce that afternoon. She almost didn't. She stood outside the Pierce gate for a full minute, her hand on the post, arguing with herself. Going in felt like pushing herself on someone who hadn't asked for her. Not going in felt like abandoning someone who might need her. She went in. Clara was in the kitchen. Thomas was in the back room. Elowen could hear his breathing from where she stood in the doorway, shallow and too fast, the sound of a child whose body was working harder than it should. Clara looked up when she came in. Her face was the face of a woman who had not slept and did not know when she would. "I'm not here to tell you what to think," Elowen said. "I just came to see how you were." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Did my boy eat something wrong?" "No," Elowen said. "Lamb's quarters don't cause fever. Neither do nettles or purslane or wild onions. I've eaten them my whole life. My grandmother ate them her whole life." She paused. Can't explain Thomas's fever, but didn't come from the plants. Clara's hands were flat on the table, pressing down like she needed to feel something solid. "Marlena says I know what Marlena says. She has a point, Elowen. You're asking people to eat things nobody's ever eaten before. Not in this valley. Your grandmother ate them," Elowen said, "and her grandmother before her. They ate whatever they could find because they had to, and they were right to. We've just forgotten." Clara was quiet. Thomas made a sound in the back room, not distress, just shifting, and Clara's head turned toward it automatically, the way a mother's head always turned. "I'm not going to stop you from whatever you decide," Elowen said. "That's your right. But I'm not going to say the plants are dangerous when they're not, because that's a lie, and a lie. And a lie right now would hurt more people than the truth will." She left the bundle of nettles on Clara's table and walked out. The next morning, the letters started. The first one was slipped under the door sometime before dawn. Elowen found it when she came down to start the stove, a folded piece of paper with no signature, the handwriting cramped and deliberate. She opened it standing in the kitchen in her night clothes, the floor cold under her bare feet. It said, "You are putting families in danger, and you know it. Stop what you are doing, or the consequences will not be on my hands." She read it twice. Then she folded it and set it on the table and started the stove. She showed it to Silas at breakfast. He read it and his jaw went tight, and he set it down with the particular careful restraint of a man controlling something he would rather not control. "Who do you think?" he said. "I don't know. Maybe several people. Maybe one person several times." She poured his coffee. "It doesn't matter who. It matters to me, I know." She sat down. "But what are you going to do with the information, Silas? Go confront someone. That helps no one." He looked at her. "You're not angry." "I'm angry," she said. "I'm just not going to lead with it." He looked at her in a way he hadn't in a while, attentive, like he was seeing something new. Then he picked up his cup and didn't say anything else. There were 2 more letters over the next 3 days. The second one was longer, more specific. It mentioned children by name. Polly Mercer and the Hall girls, and 2 of Clara's younger ones, said that Elowen had been filling their heads with dangerous nonsense, and that a real woman would be tending her proper garden instead of prowling the creek for things that had no business on a family's table. The third one was short. It said only, "We're watching." Elowen read each one, felt the particular sick cold they produced in her chest, and put them in a box on the high shelf in the pantry. She wasn't sure why she kept them. Some instinct told her that evidence had a way of mattering later, even when you couldn't see exactly how. Meanwhile, the families who'd stopped coming to the creek were running out of stored food faster than they'd expected. It was the beans, mostly the dry beans, that most families kept in barrels, which were supposed to last through the first hard months of winter, but which had been drawn down faster once the fresh vegetables disappeared. 3 weeks since the beetles had come through, and the families who'd refused Elowen's plants were looking at their provisions with a new kind of arithmetic. She knew this not because anyone told her, but because she could see it in the way people moved through town. The particular tightness around the eyes of a woman who was portioning things more carefully. The way men stood at the general store and looked at prices and put things back. Harlan Briggs, who ran the store had mentioned to Silas that he'd taken in more dried goods in the past 2 weeks than in the previous 2 months, combined people trading whatever they had for staples, drawing down reserves that were meant to carry them into spring. It was one afternoon, a Thursday overcast, with the smell of coming rain when Elowen was returning from the creek and passed a group of women talking in the road. They went quiet when they saw her, which was worse than if they'd said something. Quiet was its own kind of language. She kept walking. She didn't look back. That night, she sat on the porch alone, after Silas had gone to sleep, and she let herself feel the weight of it, the letters, the silence in the road, Dorothea staying away, the row husband's closed-door face. She wasn't made of stone. She felt all of it. She just had a habit of feeling things fully before she decided what to do with them, rather than letting the feeling decide for her. The honest truth, sitting there in the dark, was that she was tired. Not from the work, she didn't mind the work. She was tired from the particular effort of holding her ground while the ground kept shifting. She was tired of being certain about something she couldn't prove in a way that satisfied everyone, carrying knowledge that was real and complete and couldn't defend itself in public because the person who'd given it to her was dead and the only proof she had was herself. She was tired, and she stayed outside until she wasn't, and then she went inside and went to bed. What she didn't know, what nobody had told her yet, was that it wasn't just family stopping. Polly Mercer. Gideon Mercer had found out that Polly had been going to the creek with Elowen in the mornings, and he'd sat Polly down the previous evening and told her in a voice that didn't allow discussion that she was not to go back. Polly had sat through the conversation with her jaw set and her eyes somewhere else, and when her father finished, she'd said, "She's not hurting anyone." And Gideon had said, "I didn't ask for your opinion," and that had been the end of it. Polly hadn't gone back to the creek, but she hadn't forgotten anything Elowen had taught her either. What also happened that week, quietly and with no announcement, was that Margaret Rowe's youngest daughter, a girl of 11 named Bess, who had a very practical relationship with hunger, had been slipping down to the creek on her own in the evenings and harvesting lamb's quarters and purslane and hiding them in the barn to dry. She hadn't told her parents. She hadn't told anyone. She'd listened to Elowen the 3 times she'd been allowed to come, before her father said no, and she'd retained more than anyone would have guessed, and she was doing what 9-year-old Elowen had done in the hill country, just quietly learning the land, because the land was there, and it made sense. Children understood necessity more clearly than adults did. Adults had pride as a variable. Children mostly had hunger. Elowen found out about Bess Rowe 2 weeks later, when Margaret came to her door with a complicated expression that took Elowen a moment to decode. "My daughter has been gathering on her own," Margaret said. "Creek." Elowen waited. "She's been feeding it to the chickens," Margaret said. "Testing it, she told me, because she wanted to know if it was safe before she brought it inside." A pause. "The chickens are fine." Elowen looked at her. "Bess is a smart girl. She's a disobedient girl." But the way Margaret said it was not entirely without admiration. "The point is, we have a barn half full of dried greens, and we don't know what to do with most of it. I can show you," Elowen said. Margaret stood on the porch for another moment, and the complicated expression worked itself into something simpler and less comfortable. "I was wrong to stop coming," she said. Not quite an apology. Honest accounting version of one. "You were scared," Elowen said. "It's not wrong. Don't make it easy for me," Margaret said. "I don't deserve easy." Elowen almost smiled. "Come inside," she said. By the 4th week after the beetles, there were 7 families in Ash Hollow who had been consistently gathering and preserving wild plants under Elowen's instruction, and those 7 families were in meaningfully better shape than most of the rest of the valley. They still had greens. They had dried nettles that made a soup that wasn't anyone's preference but was hot and nourishing. They had preserved wild onions that added something to the beans that were otherwise the same beans every night. They had purslane that could be eaten raw when there was nothing else ready, its thick leaves holding more moisture than anything else growing along the creek bank. None of it was what anyone would have chosen. None of it was cabbages or potatoes, or a good squash baked with brown sugar the way Dorothea Hall made them every fall. But it was food, and it was there, and the families who had learned to see it were eating. Then the second wave of rumors began, and this one was different from the first. The first wave had been about Thomas Pierce specific, localized, a child's illness that could be connected to a person and a practice. The second wave was more diffuse and more dangerous because of it. It was the kind of rumor that moved without any single source, the kind that everyone had heard from someone else. And by the time it came back around, it had been rephrased and rerouted enough times that the original claim was hard to find. The gist of it was this: Elowen Hartley had known the beetles were coming and had said nothing. She had let the Valley's gardens fail, and then had positioned herself as the person with the solution so that families would become dependent on her. It was an absurd claim, but absurdity had never been a reliable defense against a rumor that people were primed to believe. Elowen heard it first from Ellen Brennan, who came to tell her directly because she was old enough not to bother with softening things. "They're saying you wanted this to happen," Ellen said. Elowen sat with that for a moment. "And you? I've known you 3 years," Ellen said. "You don't have the patience for scheming. You barely have the patience for people." A pause. "I mean that kindly." "I know you do. What are you going to do about it?" "Keep feeding people," Elowen said. Ellen made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sigh. "That's not going to be enough. It's what I have." What Elowen knew, and what she was doing her best not to think about too directly, was where this second round of rumors had come from. Couldn't prove it. She had no witness, no letter, no piece of paper. But the logic of it pointed in one direction, and that direction was Marlena Crow. Marlena hadn't come to her, hadn't confronted her directly, hadn't shown up at the creek, hadn't said a word to Elowen's face. She was operating entirely at the edge of Elowen's life, in the spaces where Elowen wasn't present the well, store, the small gatherings of women after the men had gone to work. Elowen didn't know exactly what was being said in those spaces, only its echoes which arrived distorted and incomplete. It was a particular kind of battle, and it was one Elowen didn't know how to fight. She was good at things she could see and name. She was good at walking to a plant and saying, "Here is what this is, and here is what it does." She was not good at fighting something she couldn't see, using weapons she didn't have. Silas thought she should confront Marlena directly. "Clear the air," he said. "Say what needs saying. You've never been afraid of a hard conversation." "This isn't about being afraid," Elowen said. "Confronting Marlena publicly gives her exactly what she wants a stage. Right now, I'm just the woman at the creek. If I go to Marlena and make this into a fight, I'm the woman fighting Marlena Crow, and that's a different story." Silas thought about it. "So what do you do instead?" "I'm still thinking," she said. She was thinking about Agatha Whitmore. Agatha was 81 years old and had been in the valley since before most of the current families had arrived. She didn't leave her house much anymore. Her knees had gotten bad 3 winters back, but people came to her. Still, the way people went to something reliable when everything else was uncertain. She wasn't a formal authority. She held no position. But her judgment carried a weight that came from having outlasted most of the certainties of the people around her. And in Ash Hollow, that counted for something. Elowen had met Agatha twice briefly in passing. She knew her by reputation more than anything else. She also knew, because Ellen Brennan had told her that Agatha had been watching the situation with Elowen from a distance and had not yet said anything publicly, which meant, Elowen thought, that Agatha was waiting for something. She wasn't sure yet what that something was, or whether she was the right person to provide it. But she was running out of other options, and the valley was running out of time. And sometimes the only move available was the one you weren't entirely sure about. She talked to Silas about it that night, sitting at the table after supper. "Agatha Whitmore," he said. "Yes." He turned his cup in his hands. "Think she'll help you?" "I don't know. I think she might be willing to listen, which is more than most people are right now. And if she listens and decides you're wrong?" Elowen was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll have to live with that." Silas looked at her across the table. The lamp was low and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the wind was picking up, the first suggestion of the cold that was still coming, that hadn't fully arrived yet, but was close enough to smell. "You're going to go," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Then go soon," he said, "before this gets any further out of hand." She nodded. She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand briefly, the way people who have been married a long time touch each other, not dramatically but with accuracy, and he turned his hand over and held hers for a moment and then let go. That was enough. She started planning the visit to Agatha for the following morning. But before morning came, a fourth letter appeared under her door, and this one was not anonymous and was not a warning. This one was signed with a name she didn't recognize, and it said that two families on the north side of the valley, families she hadn't been in contact with, families she hadn't known were in difficulty, had children who were hungry, not sick, not feverish, just hungry, and that they had heard she might be able to help. She read it standing in the kitchen in the dark, the lamp not yet lit, the paper catching what little light came through the window, folded it, and put it in her pocket. In the morning, before she went to see Agatha, she went to the creek. She had baskets to fill. She went to the creek first, the way she always did. The morning was cold enough that her breath came out in small clouds, and the ground along the bank had a crust to it not frozen hard, not yet, but getting there. She filled both baskets methodically, working from memory. Her hands, finding the plants, the way hands find familiar things in the dark. Lamb's quarters. Nettles handled carefully, the cloth wrapped twice around her palm. Good stand of purslane near the bend where the water slowed. Wild onions pulled clean from the soft soil near the water's edge, their smell sharp and honest in the cold air. She worked without hurrying. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying at the creek was counterproductive. You missed things. You pulled up plants that weren't ready. You left the bank worse than you found it. Creek didn't reward rushing. Neither in her experience did most things worth doing. By the time she had what she needed for the North families, the ones who'd sent the unsigned letter, whose children were hungry in a quiet way that nobody was talking about publicly, she had enough left over to deliver to Ellen Brennan and still have a portion for her own kitchen. She sorted it as she walked home, shifting the baskets, rearranging weight. The muscles in her shoulders had adapted to this over the years. Barely noticed it anymore. Silas was already gone to the fields when she got back. He'd left coffee on the stove, still hot, and a note on the table in his blocky handwriting that said simply, "Be careful today." She read it twice, folded it, and put it next to the letters in her pocket. She delivered the North family's food first because they needed it most and because she wanted it done, before the valley fully woke up and the day's complications arrived. The families lived on the far end of the creek road, past the Mercer place, in a stretch of land that was rougher and less established than the center of the valley newer settlers. People who hadn't been in Ash Hollow long enough to have the kind of reserves that older families had built up. The man who answered the door at the first house was maybe 35, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been managing a crisis quietly for too long. He looked at the baskets with an expression Elowen recognized relief held back by pride losing. "You didn't have to come yourself," he said. "I was already at the creek," she said. He nodded slowly. His wife appeared behind him. A toddler balanced on her hip and looked at the baskets with an expression that was simply grateful, without the complication. "I'll show you where to find these," Elowen said. "You won't need to wait on me." She spent an hour at the north end of the valley, walking both families through the creek bank plants. She'd gathered that morning, not the full lesson, just enough to get them started, enough so they could feed their children tonight and tomorrow, and find more the day after. The woman from the first house, her name was Vera, and she had a quickness to her that suggested she'd been practical. All her life asked good questions and retained the answers immediately, the way certain people retained things when they were motivated by necessity. The nettles, Vera said, holding a stem carefully between her cloth-wrapped fingers. You said they'd blanch out completely. Boiling water, 2 minutes and the sting is gone. After that, it's just greens. And you can dry them? Hang them upside down somewhere with air moving through. Dry in 3 or 4 days. After that, they'll keep for months. Vera looked at the nettles with the focused attention of someone revising their understanding of the world. It was a look Elowen had seen before, on the faces of people who were realizing that a resource they'd walked past for years had been there all along, waiting for them to stop ignoring it. It was on the walk back from the North families that the day turned. She was coming along the road toward the center of the valley, both baskets lighter now, when she heard her name. Not spoken to her, spoken about her, in the gap between 2 houses, where a group of women had gathered in the way. Women in small valleys gathered when something needed to be processed. She caught enough before they noticed her name, Thomas Pierce's name, the word she said it was safe. The women saw her and went quiet all at once. The way birds on a wire all lift at the same time. Elowen didn't slow down. She nodded to the ones she knew by name and kept walking, and behind her the silence held for exactly as long as it took her to get past the gap between the houses. And then the murmuring started again, low and continuous, like water finding its way through rock. She had known this was coming. Knowing it was coming had not made it easier to walk through. She went home, put the baskets away, washed her hands at the pump, and then stood in the kitchen for a minute, with her hands flat on the table, pressing down the way Clara had pressed down that first day. Then she picked up her coat and went to Agatha Whitmore's house. Agatha's house was at the top of a slight rise at the west end of the valley, set back from the road behind a stand of old cottonwoods that had been there longer than anyone could remember. The house itself was modest 2 rooms, a covered porch, a well-tended kitchen garden that had not entirely escaped the beetles, but had been better protected than most because it was partly under the cottonwood canopy, and the beetles had moved in patterns that followed the open fields more than the shade. Agatha had been watching the beetle damage from her porch. Elowen knew this because Ellen had told her. Agatha watched most things from her porch. She was there when Elowen arrived, sitting in a wooden chair with a blanket over her lap, despite the fact that the morning had gotten warmer. She was a small woman, thinner than Elowen remembered from their brief previous meetings, with a face that had the particular quality of very old faces, not fragile exactly, but distilled, as if everything unnecessary had been removed over the years, and what was left was only what mattered. She watched Elowen come up the path and didn't say anything until Elowen reached the porch steps. I wondered when you'd come, Agatha said. I wasn't sure I should, Elowen said, but here you are. Agatha gestured at the other chair on the porch, the one that always had something on it, a book, a basket, some project or another. Today it had a folded piece of cloth on it. Agatha moved it without being asked, and Elowen sat down. For a moment neither of them said anything. Cottonwoods moved in the light wind, and the valley spread out below them. The ruined gardens, visible even from this distance, the bare stems, the disturbed soil, the places where something had been and was no longer. They're saying I poisoned a child, Elowen said. They're saying you might have, Agatha said. There's a difference. Not much of one, in practice. Agatha looked at her directly. Her eyes were the kind of clear that sometimes happened in very old people, as if the years had worn away the cloudiness that accumulated in younger ones. Did you? No. What does Thomas have? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But lamb's quarters don't cause fever. I know that for a fact. How do you know it for a fact? Because my grandmother knew it, and she taught me, and the knowledge is old enough that I trust it, the way I trust that water runs downhill. Elowen paused. You can doubt that if you want. Most people do. Agatha was quiet for a moment. A A blue jay landed on the porch railing, looked at them both with the aggressive indifference of blue jays, and flew off. I grew up in the eastern mountains, Agatha said. My mother's people gathered everything. We ate lamb's quarters in summer, and dried nettles in winter and purslane whenever we could find it. A pause. Stopped when I came to the valley, because it wasn't how things were done here. I let myself forget. She said this last part in a way that suggested she had not, in fact, forgotten, but had simply stopped accessing it. So no, I don't doubt your knowledge. Elowen sat with that. The relief of it was quieter than she'd expected, not a flood, just a slowing of something that had been moving too fast inside her chest. What I doubt, Agatha continued, is your strategy. Elowen looked at her. You're feeding people who are turning against you, Agatha said. That's right, and you should keep doing it. But you're letting Marlena Crow operate in spaces you can't see, and that's going to cost you more than a few families stopping their lessons. I know, Elowen said. I don't know what to do about it. I do, Agatha said. But you won't like it. Tell me anyway. Agatha looked at her steadily. You need to wait. Elowen blinked. Wait for what? For Thomas to recover. Agatha's voice was even, and for the doctor to arrive. Dr. Lander comes through the valley every 6 weeks. He's due in 3 weeks. When he comes, Thomas's fever will have run its course, because Thomas Pierce has had this fever before. Seen it. 15 years ago, his older brother had it. Same time of year, same pattern. It goes on its own. It always has. Elowen stared at her. You've seen this before. Twice, Agatha said. There's something in this valley that hits certain children in autumn. I don't know what it is. But it's not new, and it's not your plants. The weight of this settled over Elowen slowly, and then all at once. Thomas Pierce's fever had a history. It had been here before she'd ever brought a basket to the creek, before she'd ever arrived in Ash Hollow. Then why isn't anyone saying so? She said. The words came out harder than she intended. Agatha's expression didn't change, because 15 years is a long time. Because the families that had children with this fever then aren't the same families that are here now. Mostly. Because people's memories are shorter than they think they are. A pause. And because Marlena Crow has been louder than anyone else, and loud fills the space that memory leaves empty. Elowen stood up. She couldn't sit still with this. She needed to move, even just the small movement of standing. She went to the porch railing and looked out at the valley. 3 weeks. She said. At least, Agatha said, maybe 4. Families are running low on food. If people stop coming to the creek because they're afraid of me, some of those families won't have enough to get through to spring. I know that. And you're telling me to wait. I'm telling you to wait on the reputation problem, Agatha said. Keep feeding people. Keep going to the creek. Don't confront Marlena, because she wants that and she'll win it. But let Thomas's fever run its course, and let the doctor confirm what I know. A pause. I'll go to the well. I'll say what I know about the history of this fever. I should have done it sooner. That's my failure, not yours. But it will carry more weight if I wait until the community is ready to hear it. Elowen turned back to look at her. And if someone else gets sicker before then? Agatha held her gaze. Then we deal with that when it happens. You can't protect everyone from every possibility. You can only do what's right in front of you. Elowen wanted to argue with that. She understood the logic of it, and she still wanted to argue, because the logic was cold, and the hunger was real, and the 3 weeks felt like a canyon. She had to cross one step at a time, without being able to see the other side to it. Agatha was looking at her with the particular patience of someone who had been right about difficult things enough times to know what it felt like, and Elowen was not a fool. All right, she said. Sit back down, Agatha said. I'll make tea. I still have some dried lemon balm that the beetles didn't touch. The faint absurdity of this being offered wild plants by an 81-year-old woman in the middle of a crisis about wild plants was not lost on Elowen. She sat back down. Over tea, Agatha told her about the valley's history, in the way that very old people tell history, not as a sequence of events, but as a texture. A fabric of things that had happened and been forgotten and happened again in slightly different shapes. She talked about 2 droughts, a flooding year, a hard winter that had killed a third of the livestock. She talked about families who had come and failed, and families who had come and stayed, and what the difference had been, mostly. She talked about the kinds of knowledge that got lost between generations, because the next generation was too busy establishing itself to stop and learn what the previous one knew. The problem, Agatha said, is that every generation thinks it arrived at the right answer, that the way they do things is the settled version. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Then something happens that the settled version can't account for, and they have to choose between admitting that and finding someone to blame for the inadequacy. Elowen looked at her cup. They chose me. Marlena chose you, Agatha said. The rest of them are just following because they're scared, and she gave them a direction. A pause. Scared people need a direction. It doesn't always matter if it's right. Elowen walked home slowly, taking the long way around the south side of the valley, past the fields that had been stripped bare, past the Mercer property, where she could see Polly in the yard doing something, with a rope and a fence post. Polly didn't look up, and Elowen didn't call out. The fields had an emptiness to them that had a particular quality, not the emptiness of land that had never been planted, but the emptiness of land that remembered being full. Bare soil, the stripped stems, the occasional ghost of a plant that had been eaten down to the root level. She was halfway home when she heard the sound of running feet behind her and turned to find Polly Mercer slightly out of breath, having clearly just vaulted the fence by the look of her boots. My father said, "I can't talk to you," Polly said immediately, before Elowen could speak. "Then go back over the fence," Elowen said. Polly stood there. "I just wanted to tell you that I didn't eat the plants, and I know they're safe. I told my father that." "What did he say?" "He said I didn't know what I was talking about." A pause. "He's wrong." Elowen looked at her. The girl had Gideon's stubbornness, and something else that Gideon probably didn't know. He'd given her a capacity for holding to something she'd decided was true, even when the people around her were deciding something else. It was not always a comfortable quality to have. Elowen knew that firsthand. "Go home, Polly," she said. "The nettles by the bend," Polly said. "I've been checking on them. They're still good. The cold hasn't got them yet. There's a big stand further along than where you usually stop. I found it last week." Elowen went still. "Past the fallen cottonwood," Polly said. "About 30 more steps. There's a whole patch, bigger than the one you know about." She turned and went back over the fence and walked toward the house without looking back, and Elowen stood in the road and watched her go. She went to the creek the next morning and found the patch Polly had described larger than she'd expected, sheltered by the fallen cottonwood in a way that had protected it from the worst of the cold. It would last another 2 or 3 weeks, maybe more, enough to matter. She harvested what she could carry and thought about Polly all the way home. Meanwhile, in the center of Ash Hollow, things were moving faster than Agatha's 3-week timeline accounted for. Marlena Crow had not been idle during the days Elowen had been going to the creek and delivering food and visiting Agatha. She had been working the same territory. She always worked the spaces between houses, the gatherings at the well, the moments when a group of women was already assembled, and a word in the right ear would travel through all of them in under an hour. She had also been doing something more targeted and more damaging. Though Elowen didn't know this yet, she'd been visiting the men. Not all the men she knew better than that. The men in Ash Hollow didn't generally respond well to being told what to think by someone other than themselves. But she'd been visiting specific men, the ones who'd been on the fence about Elowen's creek lessons from the beginning, the ones whose wives had been going to the creek against their mild objections, the ones who had just enough unease about the situation to be persuaded by someone who offered them a clear position. Gideon Mercer was one of them. He'd already been leaning away from Elowen. His wife had told Marlena as much, though Helen Mercer had not intended the information to go anywhere. Marlena had built on that lean, had given Gideon a framework for his unease that dressed it up as reasonable concern and made him feel like a man protecting his family rather than a man following a current. Edmund Voss was another. Edmund farmed the largest parcel in the valley after the Hartley place, and his opinion carried weight not because he was particularly insightful, but because he was loud and consistent, and people confused consistency with authority. Edmund had already told his wife twice that he didn't trust a woman who spent more time at the creek than in her own garden. Marlena had spent an afternoon with Edmund's wife, and 2 days later, Edmund had gone to the general store and said within earshot of 4 other men that something needed to be done about the situation before it got worse. Nobody asked him what he meant by done. Nobody asked him what situation exactly and what worse looked like. They just heard the words and carried them. By the end of that week, something had shifted in the texture of Ash Hollow that Elowen could feel but couldn't quite locate. It wasn't any single conversation or incident. It was more like the air before a storm, the same components, just arranged differently, carrying a charge that hadn't been there before. She felt it at the creek, where the 2 women who'd been coming reliably every morning. For 2 weeks, both arrived late and left early and didn't quite meet her eyes. She felt it when she went to Harlan Briggs's store for a pound of salt, and the conversation that had been going on when she walked in, stopped, and then resumed at a different register, lighter, more careful. The way conversation shifted when someone walked into a room who was being talked about. She bought her salt and said good morning to Harlan and to the 2 men she didn't know well, who were standing at the counter, and she walked out, and she kept her back straight the whole way. She told Silas about it. Not everything she'd learned over the years to be selective with Silas, not because he couldn't handle things, but because giving him too much to worry about at once made him tight and reactive. And she needed him steady. She told him enough. He listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way. That meant he was working very hard, not to do something impulsive. Edmund Voss is saying things, he said. I don't know for certain, she said. I'm piecing it together. Edmund Voss can barely run his own operation. He's got no business, Silas. She put her hand on his arm. What Edmund Voss thinks of me is not the problem I'm solving right now. He looked at her. The tightness in his face didn't entirely go away, but it shifted. What is the problem you're solving right now? Making sure people have food while I wait for the doctor to arrive and confirm what Agatha already knows. She paused. And figuring out how many families are close enough to the edge that they can't wait 3 weeks. That redirected him. Silas was better with concrete problems than abstract ones always had been. They spent the next hour mapping out the valley from memory, which families had adequate reserves, which ones were drawing down faster than they'd expected, which ones were too proud to say anything, and which ones had already reached out, the way the North families had. Silas knew things she didn't, from his conversations at the store, and in the fields, things men told each other in the gaps of working alongside each other that they wouldn't say in their own kitchens. By the time they were done, they had a rough accounting. 7 families in comfortable shape, 12 in the middle tight, but managing. 5 in real difficulty, 3 of whom had refused or been refused Elowen's Creek lessons, and were now sitting with that decision and its consequences. The Vance family, Silas said, north of the Mercer place. Herman Vance. Last week his wife had been sick and their stores were low before the beetles even came. They can't make it to spring on what they have. Did he say anything about the creek plants? He said he didn't know enough to trust them. Elowen thought for a moment. Would he trust you? Silas looked at her. What do you mean, if you showed him? Not me, you. If you walked him to the creek and showed him the lamb's quarters and the nettles, told him you'd been eating them for weeks, told him your wife knew what she was talking about. She watched his face. Would he listen to you? The question hung between them. It was a real question. She wasn't asking him rhetorically. She was asking whether Silas Hartley, who had spent 11 years maintaining a careful distance from his wife's strange creek habits, would walk to the creek and vouch for her to a neighbor who wouldn't trust her directly. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to think he was going to say no, or worse, say nothing, which would mean the same thing in a different shape. Yes, he said finally. He'd listened to me. She felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "Then go tomorrow," she said. He went. He came back that afternoon and didn't say much about it, just told her that Herman Vance would bring his wife to the creek the day after tomorrow, and that Herman had wanted to know if the nettles really lost their sting. "What did you tell him?" Elowen asked. "I told him I'd eaten them twice last week, and I was still standing," Silas said. He said it flatly, without pride, but she heard the thing underneath it, the acknowledgement, finally, fully, that he had been standing. That the food she'd brought to their table from the creek for years had sustained him as much as anything else, and that he'd known it and not said it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just nodded and went to start the supper. But she was smiling when she turned to the stove, and she let herself have that. The next day, Thomas Pierce's fever spiked hard higher than it had been since the start. High enough that Clara sent one of the older children running through the valley to find anyone who might know what to do. Word reached Elowen at the creek, carried by Bess Rowe of all people, who appeared at the creek bank out of breath and said, "Mrs. Hartley, Clara Pierce is asking for you." Elowen stood up straight. "Thomas is worse?" "Very worse," Bess said. "The fever went up in the night." Elowen was already picking up her basket. "Where's Clara now?" "Home," she said. Bess hesitated. She said she didn't know who else to ask. That sentence. The weight of it, she didn't know who else to ask. Not that she'd decided to trust Elowen, not that she'd abandoned her doubts, just that she'd run through all her other options and come to the end of the list, and Elowen was what was left. Elowen knew that feeling. She had been that feeling, in her own life, in her own way. And she knew that sometimes being the last option was exactly the position from which you could do the most good, because the person asking had finally run out of the resistance that had been keeping help away. She walked fast. She brought the basket with the last of the morning's nettles and the jar of preserved wild onion and a small cloth packet of dried herbs she'd been keeping. For her own use, chamomile she'd found in late summer and dried carefully didn't cure fever, but made a person more comfortable while their body did what it was going to do anyway. She was halfway to the Pierce house when she saw Marlena Crow. Marlena was standing at the edge of her own property, which was on the road between the creek path and the Pierce house, and she was watching Elowen come with the basket. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there and watched, and in the watching was an entire conversation that neither of them would say out loud. Elowen met her eyes briefly and kept walking. The moment she passed, she heard Marlena begin to move not toward the Pierce house, not following her, but toward the road that led to the center of the valley, toward the well. And Elowen knew exactly what was about to happen, and she couldn't do anything about it except keep walking toward Clara's door. So she kept walking. Clara met her on the porch. Her face was the specific gray of someone who had been up all night and was running entirely on fear and forward momentum. She looked at Elowen with the particular expression of a woman who wanted help and was still not certain she had the right to ask for it. "He's worse," Clara said. "I know, Bess told me." Elowen went up the porch steps. "Let me see him," Marlena is saying, Clara. She stopped, turned, and looked directly at the other woman, not unkindly, but without any softness that would allow the conversation to wander. "I can't help Thomas if we stand here talking about Marlena. Let me see him." Clara stepped back and let her in. Thomas was in the back room, 7 years old, his face flushed and damp, his breathing the labored sound she'd heard through the wall 2 weeks ago. He was awake, which was something. He looked at Elowen when she came in with the wariness of a child who felt terrible and was not sure about the stranger at his bedside. She sat down next to him, not too close, and looked at his face properly. She was not a doctor. She had never claimed to be. But she'd grown up with a grandmother who had attended to illness the way she attended to plants carefully, attentively, without drama, and she'd absorbed enough to know the difference between a fever that was climbing toward something dangerous and a fever that was working its way through. This one was working its way through. She couldn't prove that. She couldn't say it with the authority of a medical degree. But she'd seen this pattern before. In the hill country, in children who ran hot for a week and then came down like a tide going out, exhausted but intact. She made the chamomile with hot water from Clara's stove, and she sat with Thomas while he drank it. And she showed Clara how to make a cool compress properly, not ice cold, which could shock a feverish body, but cool enough to help. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, Clara stood at the door and said, in a voice that was stripped of everything, except the essential thank you. He's going to be all right, Elowen said. You can't know that. No, she said, honestly. But I believe it. She walked home through the center of the valley, and she didn't look toward the well where she could hear voices. She walked with her empty basket, and her hands that smelled like chamomile, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead of her. Behind her, at the well, Marlena Crow was telling anyone who would listen that Elowen Hartley had gone to the Pierce house with her plants and her remedies, that she was treating a sick child with things that had no business being given to anyone who was already ill, that if something happened to Thomas Pierce, the entire valley would know exactly where to place the blame. Several women listened. Several walked away. One, Dorothea Hall, who had stayed away from the creek for 2 weeks out of deference to her husband's concern, stood at the edge of the group and listened to all of it and said nothing. But her face did something while she listened. A slow shift from uncertainty to something harder and less comfortable. The expression of a woman deciding something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. She went home and made supper, but she didn't stop thinking. And across the valley, in the north, Silas Hartley was walking Herman Vance along the creek bank, pointing out the lamb's quarters in the nettles, saying in his plain, flat way, "My wife has known about these for years, and she's been right about everything else." Herman Vance came to the creek the following morning with his wife, a thin woman named Louise who moved carefully, the way people moved when they'd been sick, long enough that their body had become a thing they had to negotiate with, rather than simply inhabit. Silas had told Elowen they were coming, and she was there when they arrived, both baskets already set down, her hands free, nothing in her posture that said she was doing anyone a favor. Louise looked at the creek bank. The way someone looked at a map of a country they'd been told was dangerous scanning for the thing that would confirm the warning. "That one," Elowen said, pointing to the lamb's quarters growing thick along the water's edge. "That's what you want to start with. Pull a leaf." "Smell it." Louise looked at her husband. Herman gave a small nod that meant go ahead. Louise pulled a leaf, held it to her nose. Her expression shifted, slightly not converted, just surprised. "It doesn't smell like much. It doesn't taste like much raw either. But cooked down in a little water with salt, it's close enough to spinach that most people stop questioning it after the second bite." Elowen crouched down and pulled a handful, turned them in her hands. The trick is not to think of it as a substitute. It's its own thing. Once you start comparing it to what you wish you had, you'll always be disappointed. Louise was quiet. Then she said, "My mother used to gather greens when I was small. I don't remember what they were. Probably something like this," Elowen said. "Most mothers knew once. It got lost somewhere between then and now." That sentence landed differently than she'd intended, not as criticism, just observation. But Louise's face did something complicated with it, some recognition that was also partly grief. Elowen moved on before it could settle into something awkward. She spent an hour with them. Herman was practical and direct, the kind of man who needed to understand the logic of something before he accepted it, and Elowen gave him the logic, which plants. Why those? How to identify them reliably, how to prepare them, how long they'd keep. He asked good questions. He wasn't warming to her exactly, but he was listening, which was all she'd asked of anyone. When they left, Louise was carrying a full basket and had asked twice more about the nettles, specifically how long to blanch them. Herman walked beside her without looking back. Silas, who had stood slightly to the side during the whole lesson, the way a man stands when he's there for support, but knows the work isn't his, fell into step with Elowen as the Vances disappeared around the bend. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They walked home without much else, which was enough. Thomas Pierce's fever broke on the 5th day, after Elowen had visited the 10th day of his illness overall. It broke the way fevers broke, not dramatically, not with any clear moment of crisis or resolution, just a gradual subsiding, cooling, a body slowly ceasing to fight as hard because it no longer needed to. Clara noticed it in the morning when she changed the compress and found his forehead merely warm instead of burning, and she sat beside his bed for a long time afterward doing nothing, just sitting, the way a person sat when a thing they'd been bracing against was no longer pressing. Thomas asked for food that afternoon. Clara made him soup from the dried nettles and preserved onion Elowen had left. He ate it without complaint, which was how Clara knew he was genuinely on the mend. He was a boy who complained about food in the specific, creative way of children who feel well enough to have opinions. She didn't go to the well to announce that Thomas had recovered. She didn't send word to Marlena. She just kept her house and watched her son eat and let the relief work through her quietly, the way large feelings needed to work when you'd been holding them at arm's length for too long. But word traveled anyway, because it always did in Ash Hollow. By the evening of the day Thomas asked for food, 4 households knew he was improving. By the next morning, 8 did. By the time the sun was fully up that second day, everyone knew, and the information moved through the valley with a slightly different quality than the rumors had, lighter, less purposeful, not pushed by anyone's agenda. Marlena heard it at the well. She was there when Martha Greer mentioned it in passing, said Thomas Pierce was up and asking for food, said Clara looked like she'd finally slept. Marlena received this information without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. She finished filling her bucket and went home and thought about what the recovery meant for the position she'd spent 3 weeks building. It meant she understood very little, or it should mean very little, if she was careful. A child recovering from a fever didn't prove that Elowen's plants had been safe. It didn't disprove her concerns. The valley didn't have to draw any particular conclusion. It could weather this. What she hadn't accounted for was Agatha Whitmore. Agatha came to the well 3 days after Thomas's fever broke. This was itself unusual enough that several women made note of it. Agatha rarely came to the well, partly because of her knees, and partly because she'd arranged her life over the past decade to require as few trips to the center of the valley as possible. But she came that morning with her bucket and her cane and her deliberate pace, and she arrived at the well when it was busy, when 6 women were already there, which Elowen later suspected was not a coincidence. Agatha filled her bucket and then she straightened up, which took a moment, and she looked around at the women assembled there, and she said, Thomas Pierce's fever. I've seen it before. Nobody spoke. 15 years ago, Agatha said. Clara Whitfield's boy, her name was Clara Whitfield then, before she married. Her oldest son ran the same fever in the same month. Different year, same pattern. 10 days, high at the peak, breaks on its own. She looked at each woman in turn with those clear old eyes. I was here. I watched it. I should have said so 3 weeks ago, when the talk started. That's my failure, and I'm owning it. A pause. What I'm not going to let stand is the idea that Elowen Hartley's plants had anything to do with a fever that has been in this valley longer than half the people currently living in it. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones that had preceded it. Not the silence of people deciding what to think, but the silence of people who had already decided something and were now quietly revising. Marlena was not at the well that morning. This was significant. She was the one person whose presence might have changed what the silence meant, who might have been able to redirect it. But she wasn't there, and the silence settled without anyone to push it in a different direction. Dorothea Hall, who had been at the well that morning and had been listening to Agatha with the focused attention of a woman who had been thinking hard about something for days, and was now being handed the piece she'd been missing, said, What about the doctor? When does Lander come through? 2 weeks, Agatha said, maybe less. Dorothea nodded slowly. Something had resolved in her face. Elowen learned all of this secondhand from Ellen Brennan, who had been at the well and who came to Elowen's house that afternoon, with the energy of someone carrying news that mattered. She told it straight, without embellishment, which was Ellen's way. Elowen's listened and didn't say anything for a moment after Ellen finished. Agatha came to the well herself, she said finally. Walked the whole way, Ellen said. You could see it caused her. Why didn't she tell me she was going to do that? Probably because you'd have told her not to strain herself, Ellen said. And she'd have ignored you, but it would have wasted time. That was almost certainly accurate. Elowen sat with the information, the fever's history, Agatha's declaration, Dorothea's face shifting at the well, and tried to calculate what it meant for the next 2 weeks. The valley's opinion was not a single thing that could be turned like a ship. It was more like weather, which moved in multiple directions simultaneously and couldn't be steered directly, only anticipated. What she knew was this: the pressure on her had eased slightly, but it hadn't broken. Marlena was still there, still operating, still the person that a significant portion of the valley looked to for its judgments about correct behavior. Agatha's statement at the well would carry weight with certain people and be dismissed by others. The doctor's arrival would matter more than anything, either of them said. 2 weeks. She had to keep feeding people for 2 more weeks. She went to the creek the next morning and found more than she'd expected. The cold had slowed some of the plants, but not stopped them, and the stand Polly had found passed. The fallen cottonwood was still producing, thick and dark green in the shelter of the log. She harvested carefully, taking what was ready and leaving what wasn't, the way her grandmother had taught her. You took what the land offered. You left the rest to offer again later. It was a discipline that felt counterintuitive when you were hungry or frightened, because fear said take everything. Grandmother had said, take only what you need, and the land will always have more. She was on her way back from the creek, both baskets heavy, when she found Gideon Mercer standing in her path. Not blocking it, he was standing to the side, in the way of a man who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome, and had positioned himself to be easy to walk past if that was how this went. He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He'd been there a minute at least, she thought, maybe longer. She stopped. He looked at her. He was a large man, broader than Silas, with a face that defaulted to severity not from cruelty, but from the habit of a man who'd spent most of his life making hard decisions without anyone to consult. His jaw was set, and then it relaxed, which cost him something visible. My daughter has been teaching my younger ones, he said. Plants. What you showed her. Elowen waited. I told her to stop going to the creek. He paused. She didn't listen. Another pause. She's 9. She's been slipping out in the mornings before I'm up. I know, Elowen said. Something moved across his face. You knew she was still coming? She found a patch of nettles I hadn't found yet, Elowen said. She told me about it. She didn't come herself after you said no. She just passed on the information. He looked at the ground. The hat turned in his hands. My family has been eating the lamb's quarters for a week, he said. Helen started putting it in the soup. I didn't know at first. A pause that stretched. Then I found out. And then I sat with it, and I realized I'd been feeling all right, and my children were all right, and I'd been wrong. The admission came out flat and factual, the way admissions came from men who weren't accustomed to making them and did it anyway. Not polished, not graceful, just true. Elowen looked at him steadily. All right, she said. He looked up. He'd been expecting something else argument, or I told you so, or some version of the vindication she'd earned, and had every right to claim. That's it, he said. You were scared for your family, she said. That's not a fault, Gideon. That's just what being a father is. She shifted the weight of the baskets. Question now is what you do with what you know, not what you did before. He was quiet for a moment. The hat stopped turning. I heard what Agatha said at the well, he said. Fever. So did a lot of people. I believed her. Another pause. I should have been more careful about what I believed before, about who I was letting decide things for me. He didn't say Marlena's name, but the sentence had the shape of her in it. Elowen didn't press it. She had no interest in making Gideon Mercer feel worse than he already felt, not because she was generous to a fault, but because it served nothing. The valley couldn't afford recrimination right now. It needed people who were willing to shift when they were wrong, and shame was the enemy of shifting. "Come to the creek tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll show Helen and the children the full lesson. Everything you need to get through to spring." He nodded once, the way men like him nodded when they'd arrived at a decision. "We'll be there." She went home and told Silas, and he listened without surprise, which meant he'd known something like this was coming. He had a better ear for the valley's undercurrents than she did, always had. He'd been tracking Gideon's position, the way he tracked weather, not dramatically, but consistently. And he'd told her 2 weeks ago that Gideon was the kind of man who'd come around if you gave him time and didn't back him into a corner. She'd given him time. She hadn't done it strategically. She'd simply had no other option, but it had been the right call regardless. The doctor arrived 9 days later, not 2 weeks. His name was Edmund Lander, and he came through Ash Hollow twice a year on a circuit that covered most of the county, driving a wagon that was organized with the particular obsessive efficiency of a man who had learned the hard way that being unable to find something in the field was not an acceptable outcome. He was 60 compact, with a beard that had gone fully white and eyes that moved quickly and rested nowhere long. He came first to the Pierce house, because Clara had sent word ahead that Thomas had been sick and was recovering, and Lander liked to see his recoveries as well as his illnesses. He examined Thomas thoroughly, asked questions about the fever's duration and pattern and peak, checked his temperature and his throat and the glands behind his ears and under his jaw. Then he sat across from Clara at her kitchen table, and she told him everything. The plants, Elowen's lessons, Marlena's warnings, the letters, the split in the valley. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual in Elowen's experience of men with expertise. They tended to interrupt before you'd finished, to demonstrate that they'd already understood before you'd completed the sentence. Lander listened all the way through. When Clara finished, he said, "The lamb's quarters, the nettles, the purslane, none of those caused this fever." "You're certain?" Clara said, "Certain enough. I've been traveling this county for 30 years. I know what these plants do to people." He paused. "What they do is feed them. That's all. A beet. I've also seen this particular fever before, in this particular valley. Not recently, but before." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Briefly. "The boy would have gotten sick, whether he'd eaten your greens or potatoes or nothing at all," Lander said. "It's not connected. It was never connected." Clara sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "People have been saying it was Elowen Hartley's fault." "People say a lot of things when they're frightened," Lander said. It's not usually accurate." He asked to be taken to Elowen next. Clara walked him herself, which was its own statement. Clara Pierce, who had been at the center of the accusation, walking the doctor to the door of the woman who'd been accused. Elowen met them on the porch. She'd seen the wagon come through the center of the valley and had been waiting, not anxiously exactly, but with the heightened attention of someone who had been anticipating a thing for 3 weeks and was now watching it arrive. Lander looked at her with the quick, settling eyes. "You're Hartley." "Elowen Hartley," she said. "I've been hearing about you." "I imagined so." He asked to see her plants, not the ones at the creek, the ones she had in her kitchen. She brought him in and showed him the dried bundles and the preserved jars and the flat trays where she had nettles drying in layers. Picked up samples, smelled them, asked specific questions about how she'd prepared them, what quantities she was recommending, whether she'd had anyone report any adverse effects beyond mild digestive adjustment in the first week, which was normal. She answered everything directly and completely. She didn't perform confidence. She was confident, which was different. There was no performance required. He examined each plant methodically. He asked about the nettles twice, specifically about the blanching process, and she showed him had a batch ready, as it happened, from that morning's harvest, and he watched her hands and the water and nodded twice to himself, in the way that meant he was confirming something he'd already known. "This is good work," he said, finally. Not warmly, he wasn't a warm man in the obvious way, but he said it like he meant it, which was worth more than warmth. "It's my grandmother's work," Elowen said. "I just kept it." He looked at her, harder than it sounds. He went to the well that afternoon. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The doctor's wagon in the center of Ash Hollow was announcement enough, and by the time he reached the well, there were 8 people already nearby, not gathered exactly, but positioned. Marlena was among them. She had anticipated this moment and had dressed for it. Accordingly, in the dark wool dress she wore to occasions that required authority. Lander spoke plainly. He said, Thomas Pierce's fever was not related to the plants. Elowen Hartley had been teaching the valley to gather and prepare. He said he had examined the plants himself and found them safe lamb's quarters, nettles, purslane, wild onions, all known edible plants with a long history of use that predated this valley and most of the people in it, he said. Agatha Whitmore's account of the fever's previous appearance in Ash Hollow was consistent with his own records, and that the child's recovery followed the same pattern. He said all of this without raising his voice, without drama, in the tone of a man reading a finding into the record. It left very little room for interpretation. Marlena listened to all of it without moving. Her face was composed, which meant she was working. When he finished, there was a silence that had the quality of something resetting, like a room after a loud sound. When the sound was gone and the air was finding its new arrangement, Edmund Voss said, "What about the risk of someone making a mistake? Picking the wrong plant? A real risk," Lander said, which is why education matters, which is why what Hartley has been doing teaching people to identify specific plants with specific characteristics is the correct approach. He looked at Voss directly. The answer to the risk of ignorance is not more ignorance. It's knowledge. Voss didn't have an answer to that. He wasn't the kind of man who could manufacture one quickly when the thing he'd been using to anchor his position was removed. Marlena said, "You've been here one afternoon. She's been here for years. Doesn't mean she's been right all along." Every head turned toward Marlena. It was the first time she'd spoken, and the voice was the same voice from the well, 3 weeks ago level, carrying, confident of its right to take up space. Lander looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't. You're right about that. Being here longer doesn't make you automatically correct." A pause. But in this specific case, she is correct. Those plants are safe. They are nourishing, and the people who have been eating them are in better shape than the people who haven't. He picked up his bag. "That's not my opinion. That's what I've observed in the past 3 hours." He left the well shortly after, back to his wagon, back to the circuit that didn't pause for anything. Elowen was at her kitchen table when Clara Pierce knocked on her door and said, "He said what needed saying." "I heard," Elowen said. She had not been at the well, because going to the well to watch the doctor vindicate her would have felt like gloating. And gloating was the kind of thing that played well in the moment and cost you later. Clara stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said. I let fear." She stopped. She had the frustrated expression of a woman who couldn't find words adequate to what she needed to say. "You did what you thought was right for your son," Elowen said. "That's what you should have done. I still should have trusted you more." "Maybe," Elowen said. "But you came to me when it mattered. That counts." Clara didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded, and there was something in the nod that meant she was going to come back to the creek, and she was going to bring her older children, and she was going to learn properly this time. Elowen could see it in the nod the way she could read plants in their early stages, the potential of what they were going to become when the conditions were right. The next morning she went to the creek and found more people waiting than had come in 2 weeks. Dorothea Hall was there, with her husband's permission, and without it. Simultaneously, she had told him she was going, and he had not stopped her, which in the Hall house was how permission was granted. The Vance family was there, Louise moving more carefully than the others, but moving. 3 women Elowen hadn't taught before stood at the edge of the group with the particular combination of wanting to be there and not wanting to be seen, wanting it. Elowen started from the beginning. She didn't assume what people knew or didn't know. She pointed to the lamb's quarters and said, "This is what it is, and here is how you know it, and here is how you handle it, and here is what you do with it once you're home." She moved from plant to plant the way her grandmother had moved, talking to each one, letting her hands be part of the explanation. The morning was cold enough that everyone's breath came in clouds, and the creek ran quiet and dark, and nobody complained about the cold. What she did not know was what was happening simultaneously on the other side of the valley. Gideon Mercer had gone to the well, not when Lander was there later, in the afternoon when the group had dispersed and the well was being used only for its intended purpose. He'd gone with a bucket in each hand, and when he reached it, Edmund Voss was there, also with a bucket, and they'd nodded at each other the way men nodded. Then Gideon said, "I was wrong about Elowen Hartley." Voss looked at him. "I told Helen not to trust her. I kept Polly away from the creek. I let other people's concerns become my own without looking at the thing myself." He set one bucket down. "My family has been eating her plants for a week, and they're fine. My daughter learned more from that woman in 3 mornings than I learned about this land in 10 years. He looked at Voss directly. The doctor said what he said. Agatha said what she said. I'm saying what I know from my own house. Voss was quiet for a moment. He was a man who operated on consensus, not a leader exactly, more of an amplifier, carrying forward whichever signal was loudest. And right now the signal had shifted, and he felt it. I might have said some things, Voss said, at the store. You did, Gideon said. I did too. In different places, a pause. Something should probably be done about that. It wasn't an apology. It was 2 men acknowledging a record that needed correcting, in the practical way of men who weren't built for apology but understood obligation. Voss drew his water and thought about it, and by the next day he'd said something corrective at the store, in the same earshot where the original comments had been made, and the men who'd heard the first things heard the second things too. And the information moved through the valley's male channels the way Agatha's statement had moved through the female ones. Imperfect, incomplete, but present. Silas heard about Gideon at the well from Herman Vance, who had been drawing water at the other end and hadn't announced himself. Herman told Silas the way men told things briefly, factually, without decoration. Silas came home and told Elowen, and she sat with it for a long time. Gideon said that? She said finally. In those words, Silas said, more or less. She thought about Polly, vaulting the fence with her boots muddy, telling her about the nettle patch past the fallen cottonwood. She thought about the 9-year-old girl who had found a patch of plants her mother didn't know about, and her father had told her to ignore and had told Elowen anyway because she decided it mattered. She thought that sometimes the person who changed things wasn't the one everyone was watching. I need to tell Polly something, she said. Polly Mercer? Yes. Silas looked at her. What? She thought for a moment. That she was right, Elowen said. And that being right when the people around you are wrong is one of the harder things a person can do. And she should know that someone noticed. The next morning she stopped at the Mercer fence on her way to the creek. Polly was in the yard, which felt less like coincidence than like the particular awareness children had about things that were happening to them, without being told directly. She came to the fence when she saw Elowen, and she had that same expression, 9 years old and certain, and also aware that certainty had a cost. Your father was at the well yesterday, Elowen said. Polly already knew. Of course she did. He said the right thing, Elowen said, and that took something. Give him that. A pause. But the thing he said about your family using the plants, about you, knowing what you knew that started with you. You went and looked at something yourself instead of taking someone else's word for it. She looked at Polly directly. Matters more than most people will ever tell you. Polly looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Can I come back to the creek? Ask your father, Elowen said. What if he says no again? Then ask him why, and listen to the answer, and decide what you think about it. Elowen picked up her baskets. You're going to have to do that your whole life. Might as well start practicing. She walked on toward the creek, and behind her, she heard Polly go back toward the house. and she heard faintly, barely the sound of a door opening and a girl's voice starting a sentence. She didn't hear the answer. She didn't need to. At the creek, she found the nettle patch past the fallen cottonwood still producing, still green and thick in its shelter, and she worked quietly and methodically in the cold morning air, her hands steady, her breath coming in small clouds, filling the baskets one handful at a time. She was almost done when she heard someone come along the bank behind her, and she turned, expecting one of the women from the morning group who sometimes arrived late. It was Marlena Crow. She was alone. No bucket, no basket. She was wearing her good wool coat and she looked. Elowen registered this with some surprise tired. Not defeated, not broken, not any of the things that happen to people in stories when they were proved wrong. Just tired, in the ordinary human way of someone who had been working at something that wasn't working and had finally acknowledged that to themselves, if not yet to anyone else. She stopped when she reached Elowen. She looked at the baskets, at the nettles, at the creek. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Marlena said, "I was told there was a new stand of nettles past the cottonwood." Elowen looked at her. "Ellen Brennan mentioned it," Marlena said. I thought she stopped. She looked at her hands, which were clasped in front of her, and then she looked up. "I thought I might come and see for myself." It was not an apology. It was not close to an apology, but it was Marlena Crow standing at Elowen's creek, asking with the shape of her presence what she could not yet bring herself to ask with words. Elowen looked at her for a moment longer. Then she reached into the nearer basket and held out a bundle of nettles, thick-stemmed, dark green, still cold from the bank. "Take the cloth off my left hand," she said. "Wrap it twice around your palm." Marlena stood still for a moment. Then she reached out and unwound the cloth, and Elowen showed her how to hold a nettle without getting hurt. Marlena didn't come back to the creek the next day. Elowen hadn't expected her to. What had happened at the creek bank, the unwound cloth, the nettle held carefully between Marlena's cloth-wrapped fingers. The half-hour of instruction that neither of them named as what it was had been a beginning of something, not the thing itself. Beginnings were often like that. They looked small from the outside. They felt enormous from the inside, and the person in the middle of one rarely knew which direction it would grow until time had passed, and they could look back at it from a distance. Elowen went to the creek the following morning, as she always did, and found the usual group, plus 2 new faces, a woman from the far edge of the valley she'd seen only at a distance before, and the woman's teenage daughter, who had the sullen, helpful quality of a teenager who'd been told they were coming, whether they wanted to or not, and had decided halfway there that they actually did want to. Elowen taught them both the same way she taught everyone, starting with what was in front of them, naming it, explaining it, letting the knowledge be concrete before she asked anyone to trust it. Cold was deepening. She could feel it in the creek bank, which was firmer now underfoot, and in the plants themselves, which were slowing down at the tips, even as the established roots continued to push growth up from below. She'd been watching the nettles at the Polly found patch carefully. They'd last another week, maybe less, depending on how the temperature moved at night. She was already thinking about what would carry the valley through the weeks after the nettles went, which was the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since August. Not just the crisis, but the long, ordinary months after it, because that was the part nobody had thought about yet. The beetle swarm had been the emergency, and emergencies had a way of consuming all available attention. But what came after an emergency wasn't safety. It was just the next long stretch of ordinary difficulty, and ordinary difficulty required different resources than a crisis did. Required planning and patience, and the willingness to see the land as something that offered things year-round, rather than in a single harvest season, which was a different way of thinking than most people in Ash Hollow had ever been asked to adopt. She was thinking about this on the walk home from the creek, when Polly Mercer fell into step beside her. Polly had been coming back to the creek for 4 mornings in a row, with Gideon's permission, which had apparently been granted the same morning. Elowen had stopped at the fence. Polly had asked. Gideon had looked at her for a long moment, and then he'd said, "Fine, go," and gone back inside before either of them could make anything more of it. That was how Polly described it, in the flat, accurate way she described most things. "My father came to watch yesterday," Polly said. "He stood back where he thought no one could see him." Elowen glanced at her. "Could you see him?" "Obviously," Polly said. "He's very large." Elowen almost smiled. "Did he stay the whole time?" "Almost. He left when you started on the purslane, but I think that was because he had something to do, not because he'd stopped watching." She paused. "Asked C at supper what the difference was between lamb's quarters and something that might look like it, but wasn't safe. He said he was asking for practical reasons." "What did you tell him?" "I told him what you told me. The texture of the leaf and where it grows, and what the underside looks like." She said this with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who had learned a thing well enough to explain it. He listened. Elowen walked for a moment in silence. The road was firm under their feet, and the sky overhead was the particular low white of a sky holding weather that hadn't decided yet what form to take. She thought about Gideon Mercer, standing back behind the cottonwoods at the edge of the creek bank, large and reluctant and watching. And she felt something toward him that wasn't quite forgiveness. She hadn't needed to forgive him in the first place, exactly, but was something more like recognition. He was trying to learn a thing that didn't come easily to him, in a way that didn't require him to announce the trying. That was its own kind of courage, the unglamorous kind that nobody wrote about because it didn't make for a good story. "Tell your father," Elowen said, "that if he wants to come to the creek himself, he's welcome. There's no ceremony involved. People just show up." Polly nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. "I'll tell him," she said. "He'll say he doesn't need to." A pause, and then he'll probably show up. She peeled off toward the Mercer gate, and Elowen walked the rest of the way home alone. Winter arrived, as Agatha had warned it would, early and without concession. The first hard freezes came on a Thursday night in late October, and by Friday morning the creek was edged with ice, and the last of the nettles at Polly's patch had gone black and soft, cold finally reaching what it had been reaching toward for weeks. Elowen had been ready for it. The previous 2 weeks, she'd pushed the preservation harder than ever, more drying, more storage, more detailed instruction on what to do with each plant once it was prepared. She'd gone through every family who'd been coming to the creek and assessed what they had laid in and what they still lacked. And for the ones who were short, she'd supplemented from her own stores without making it a transaction. Just left things on doorsteps or handed them over in passing without building a moment around it. The morning after the hard freeze, she walked the creek bank anyway. Not to harvest, there was nothing left to take. She walked it, the way you walked a place you knew well after something had changed, needing to see the change with your own eyes, so your mind could update its picture. Ice at the edges was thin enough still to see the water moving darkly beneath, and the bank was bare in the way of things waiting rather than things finished. The lamb's quarters were down, the purslane gone entirely, the wild onions dormant under the soil, but not dead. They'd come back. She knew they'd come back. That was the thing about plants that people who didn't pay attention to them missed. Most of what looked like an ending was actually a pause. She stood at the bend in the creek for a while, not doing anything, and she felt the cold settle around her and thought about her grandmother, who had stood in cold places her whole life and never seemed diminished by them. Her grandmother had said, once, just once, while they were both crouched at a creek bank not unlike this one, that the land was not generous. Generous implied a gift, something given from surplus. The land was not generous. It was simply continuous. Kept going. It kept producing, so it kept offering what it had to offer. And whether you saw that or not was your business, not the land's. Elowen had been maybe 8 years old when her grandmother said that, and she hadn't fully understood it until she was somewhere in her 30s, and she was still working out the edges of it now. But standing at the frozen creek bank with the bare valley stretching out behind her, she understood the part that mattered most to her. In this moment, the land had kept going all through August and September and October. While the valley panicked and accused and argued, and forgot itself. The creek had been right here, offering what it had. It hadn't needed anyone's permission. It hadn't needed anyone's approval. It had just continued, patient and indifferent and full. She walked home. That afternoon, she got a letter. Not under the door, this time delivered properly, by the hand of a boy she didn't recognize, who said he'd been asked to bring it from the county seat and had been on the road since early morning. The letter was on good paper, written in a formal hand that had obviously been composed by someone who thought carefully about what they put in writing. It was from the Harwick County Agricultural Society. It said they had heard through Dr. Edmund Lander, who had apparently written to them after his visit to Ash Hollow, about the situation in the valley following the beetle damage, and specifically about the work of one Elowen Hartley in teaching families to identify and use edible wild plants as a supplementary food source during the crisis. They were writing to ask whether Mrs. Hartley would be willing to present her methods and knowledge at the Society's spring gathering, to be held in April in the county seat, and whether she might be interested in contributing to a written guide on edible valley plants for distribution to farming families throughout the county. Elowen read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Then she put it down and sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. Silas came in from outside, read the look on her face, and came to stand behind her. She handed him the letter without explanation. He read it over her shoulder, which took him a little longer than it would have taken her, because Silas read slowly and thoroughly in the way of a man who wanted to understand exactly what he'd agreed to before he agreed to anything. When he was done, he set the letter back on the table. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "You're going to say yes." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a direction. It was just Silas reading her the way he'd learned to read her over 11 years. The way you learn to read a piece of land after you'd worked it long enough, knowing where the soft spots were, the drainage ran, what the particular quality of a morning meant about the afternoon to come. "I'm going to say yes," she confirmed. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. He looked at the letter on the table. "Your grandmother would have said something practical about this," he said. "She would have said, 'Don't wear your good boots to the county seat until you've seen the roads.'" He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the short, controlled version he used in company, but the real one, which was quieter and came from somewhere further down. She hadn't heard it in a while. She'd missed it. "I'll write back today," she said. "I know you will." He stood up, pushed the chair back in carefully. "I'll put the kettle on." She wrote the reply that afternoon at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd read the threatening letters, the same table where she and Silas had mapped the valley's hunger together, the same table where she'd drunk her coffee and held herself steady through weeks of being the person the valley was afraid of. She wrote in plain language, not formal, not performing anything. She said she would come in April. She said she would bring samples and instruction and whatever notes she could put together over the winter. She said she thought the written guide was a good idea, and she'd be glad to contribute to it, with the condition that the guide credit her grandmother's knowledge alongside her own, because the knowledge wasn't hers originally, and she wasn't going to pretend it was. She reread that last part once and left it in. Word that Elowen had been contacted by the County Agricultural Society reached Ash Hollow by the following week. She hadn't announced it, but she'd mentioned it to Ellen Brennan, and Ellen Brennan had a particular relationship with information that was better described as active than passive. By the time it was general knowledge, it had passed through enough hands that some of the details had shifted, and the version Silas heard at the general store had Elowen being appointed some kind of official county position, which was not what had happened, and was the kind of exaggeration that made her tired. But underneath the exaggeration was a fact that the valley was now handling in its own way. The woman they had spent October trying to discredit had been sought out by the county's agricultural authority on the recommendation of its own doctor. That fact had a weight to it that no version of the rumor could entirely distort. Edmund Voss said at the store, to nobody in particular, that he'd always thought Elowen Hartley had something worth paying attention to. Silas was there when he said it. Silas came home and told Elowen, and she sat with it for a moment and then said, "Well, that's one way to remember it. It was not the moment to correct the record. It was the moment to let people revise their own narratives in whatever direction allowed them to stay in the community without burning down their pride. Because burning pride left people with nothing to stand on, and people with nothing to stand on made bad decisions." She had learned this from the valley itself. In a way, the land never punished you for getting it wrong the first time. It just waited for you to try again. Gideon Mercer did eventually come to the creek. It took him until the freeze had set in and there was nothing left to harvest, which meant his first morning. There was essentially a theoretical lesson Elowen walking him along the bare bank, describing what had been there and what would come back in spring, and when to expect it and what to do with it when it arrived. He walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and listened without comment, which was Gideon's version of full attention. At the end, standing at the bend where she'd stood alone, the morning after the hard freeze, he said, "My daughter's better at this than I am." "She had a head start," Elowen said. "She got it on her own," he said. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite pride, because pride was too comfortable a word for it. It was something more complicated, a father realizing that his child had become, in some specific area of knowledge, someone he'd have to catch up to. That was disorienting for a man like Gideon. He was working through it in the way he worked through most things quietly, with his jaw set, not asking for credit or sympathy. "She's going to keep learning," Elowen said. "If you let her." "I'm not going to stop her," he said. After a pause, "I wasn't really stopping her before. I was just—" "I know what you were doing," Elowen said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Once. They walked back along the creek in silence that was by that point a comfortable enough silence. Not warm exactly, but workable. And workable was what she'd always been after, with most things. The winter was hard in the specific ways that Ash Hollow winters were hard, long, and cold and gray, in a way that pressed down on the spirit if you let it, and all you could do was not let it. Families who had learned from Elowen were measurably better positioned than those who hadn't, and that fact was visible enough through November and December that the remaining holdouts, the ones who had refused for reasons of pride or stubbornness or genuine doubt, began to quietly reconsider. It happened in small ways that didn't announce themselves. A woman stopped by the Hartley porch on a Tuesday morning and said she'd heard the nettle soup was good, and could Elowen show her how to make it with the dried bundles she'd finally bought from the families who'd preserved more than they needed. Elowen showed her. A man sent his oldest son to ask about the wild onions still in the ground, whether they'd survived the frost, whether they could be dug in winter. Elowen sent back a description of how to find them and how to prepare them, and a small portion from her own stores to serve as an example of what the finished product should look like. She didn't keep track of who asked and who didn't, who'd been against her, and who'd come around, and by how much. Keeping track would have meant investing in a narrative of her own vindication, and that narrative was less useful to her than the practical work of making sure people had food. The vindication was real, she'd earned it. The doctor had confirmed it. Agatha had established at the well, but she wasn't interested in wearing it. She was interested in the spring planting, and whether the valley would have the sense to incorporate what they'd learned from the beetles into how they thought about their land going forward. That was the larger question, the one that sat beneath all the smaller ones, the one she thought about during the long winter evenings when the fire was going, and Silas was reading, and the house was quiet. Whether a single hard autumn could change something fundamental about how a community understood its relationship to the land around it, or whether the lesson would fade with the emergency that had produced it, and in 5 or 10 years, people would be back to tending their cultivated gardens, and ignoring the creek bank, the knowledge Elowen had spent the autumn teaching, already half forgotten. She didn't know. She couldn't know. She could only do what she could do, which was prepare for April and write down everything she knew, carefully, in language that didn't require her presence to make sense of it. She started the writing in January, at the kitchen table, in a composition book she'd bought from Harlan Briggs. She wrote in plain English the way she talked, without flourish. She described each plant specifically, not poetically, specifically. Shape, color, smell, texture, habitat, season, preparation, storage. She included mistakes people made and how to avoid them. She included what the plants did not do, as well as what they did, because honest instruction included the limits of a thing, not just its possibilities. She wrote about her grandmother once, in a single paragraph near the beginning, to establish where the knowledge came from and why it could be trusted. She wrote, "My grandmother learned these plants from necessity, as her mother had before her, and she taught them to me, not because she thought Mutsunyan I would need them, but because she believed knowledge had an obligation to continue. I have spent my adult life understanding what she meant by that." Crossed out the last sentence. Then she wrote it back in. Then she left it. Silas read the whole thing when she was halfway through, sitting up late one night with the lamp pulled close, and when he finished, he set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. "This is good," he said finally. "It's incomplete," she said. "Everything's incomplete," he said. "That's not a reason." She looked at him. He looked back at her. They had been having this kind of conversation for 11 years, him being plain and direct about things she was still working out, her being uncertain in ways that his certainty helped settle. She'd always thought of it as the thing they did for each other without being asked. It had taken her until this winter to understand that this was the correct definition of a marriage, not the romantic version, not the performed version, but the daily functional version. Two people who helped each other be more accurate about themselves. "I'll finish it," she said. "I know you will," he said. He went to bed and she kept writing. Marlena Crow came to her door in February. It was a Monday, overcast, with snow on the ground, but not falling. Elowen was at the table with the composition book when she heard the knock and went to the door and found Marlena standing on the porch in her good coat, her hands at her sides, not clasped the way they were at the well when she was performing authority, just hanging there, which was a different posture entirely, and one Elowen had never seen on her before. "I'd like to come in," Marlena said. Elowen stepped back and let her. Marlena stood in the kitchen and looked around, in the way people looked around, other people's kitchens, cataloging, comparing, trying to get a sense of a person from the room they cooked in. The drying bundles on the hooks, the composition book on the table, the jars of preserved plants ranked along the shelf, the cup of cold coffee Elowen hadn't finished. She looked at all of it without comment. Then she sat down, without being invited, at the kitchen table. Elowen sat across from her. They were quiet for a moment. It was a different quiet than the one at the creek, which had been mostly discomfort and a little courage. This one had more in it, more history, more of what both of them knew about what the autumn had contained. "Came to say something," Marlena said. "All right," Elowen said. Marlena looked at the table. She was not a woman who looked at tables. She was a woman who looked at faces, directly, as part of how she maintained her authority. Looking at the table meant she was doing something that her default posture didn't support. "What I said at the well," she began, "in October, and afterward she paused. I said things that weren't true. I said them in places where they would do damage, and I knew that, and I did it anyway." She looked up. "I don't have a reason for that. That makes it all right. Fear isn't a reason." Feeling she stopped, rearranged. "Feeling like you were taking up space that I was used to having isn't a reason. I know that." Elowen looked at her. "I was wrong," Marlena said, "and I was wrong in a way that hurt people. Not just you. Families who stopped coming to the creek because of what I said. The ones who went without food they could have had." She said this evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not even at all. "I've been living with that since the doctor came." "That's good," Elowen said. "You should live with it." Marlena looked at her sharply. "I don't mean that cruelly," Elowen said. "I mean that the part of you that's uncomfortable with what you did is the part worth listening to. If it had gone away by now, that would be worse." She paused. "The families on the north end had children going hungry because people were afraid of me. It's real. You helped make it happen. That's also real. She held Marlena's gaze. Those families have food now. The children are fine. And you're sitting at my table saying the thing that needed to be said. That's something. Marlena was quiet. Something moved across her face that Elowen couldn't entirely name. Not relief exactly. Not absolution. More like a door that had been stuck for a long time finally moving on its hinges. I want to learn, Marlena said. The plants. What you know. Elowen looked at her for a moment. She thought about October the well, the letters, the accumulated weight of weeks of being the valley's problem. She thought about sitting on the porch alone, at night, pressing the feeling down until she could think clearly. She thought about being tired in a way that wasn't about the work. Thought about the nettle patch past the fallen cottonwood, which Polly had found, which Marlena had stood at in November with the cloth wrapped around her palm. Plants you want to learn aren't at the creek right now, Elowen said. February. Nothing's ready, I know, Marlena said. I can wait until spring. Spring is when everything starts, Elowen said. It's also the busiest time. I'll have more people coming to the creek than I can teach properly. She paused. You could help with that. Marlena looked at her. Help how? You know how to organize people, Elowen said. You've been doing it in this valley for 20 years. You're good at it. A pause. I'm not. I know the plants. I can teach one person at a time, or 5 people at a time if they're motivated. What I can't do is manage 15 families showing up at the creek on the same morning and make sure each one gets what they need. Marlena's expression shifted less guarded, working towards something that was neither the authority face nor the table-looking face, but something in between. You'd want me involved in that. I'd want someone involved in that who's capable of doing it, Elowen said. Capable. Whether you want to is your business. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had the quality of something being decided, something that had no drama in it, because the decision had already been made somewhere earlier, and this was just the moment it became official. I'll do it, Marlena said. Good, Elowen said. Come to the creek in March when things start coming up. I'll show you the sequence, what first, what follows, how long each plant stays available. If you understand the sequence, you can help people know when to come. Marlena nodded. She stood up from the table, straightened her coat. She was not graceful at this. She was a woman who'd spent decades in a position of authority, and the motions of being a learner, rather than a director, didn't sit naturally on her yet. But she was doing it, and doing it imperfectly was the only way anyone had ever actually done it. At the door she stopped. She turned back. I heard you're writing it all down, she said. For the county. Yes. Good, Marlena said. Simply that. And then she was gone. Down the porch steps and along the road, her coat dark against the snow, getting smaller until the road bent, and she was gone. Elowen stood at the door for a moment, then closed it and went back to the kitchen table and sat down with the composition book. She picked up her pen and kept writing. April came the way it always did in the valley, tentatively, in fits and starts, a warm day followed by a cold one, the earth beginning to soften before it was quite ready to commit. The creek bank showed green first at the edges, the lamb's quarters pushing up stubborn and early, and then the nettles, and then the slow, reliable spread of purslane across the rocks. Elowen walked the bank on the first morning. She felt the real warmth in the air and took inventory the way. She took it every spring, what had come through, what hadn't, what the winter had done and what it hadn't. It had done less damage than she'd feared. The established plants were mostly intact, their roots having waited out the cold in the reliable way of things that had been waiting out cold for far longer than this particular winter. The new patch past the fallen cottonwood was already showing growth small, early, tentative, but there. She put her hand on the fallen cottonwood as she passed it, the bark rough and wet under her palm. She thought about Polly, who had found this patch in the middle of an autumn that had been trying its hardest to break people, who had gone looking, not because anyone asked her to, but because she was 9 years old and curious, and had decided that paying attention was worth something. Polly was there at the creek on the first morning of the season. alongside her mother Helen and, somewhat farther back, Gideon, who had not announced his intention to come and who stood at the bank with his arms crossed and watched his daughter correctly identify Lamb's quarters from 3 feet away and tell her mother exactly what to do with them, and whose face did something while he watched that he would not have put into words if you'd asked him, but that Elowen saw clearly from where she stood. Marlena was there too. She'd been to the creek twice in March, as agreed, and she had done what Elowen had hoped. She'd listened with the focused attention of someone who'd decided to actually learn rather than to perform learning, which were meaningfully different things. She had a notebook, which Elowen had not suggested but wasn't surprised by. She took careful notes. She asked good questions, the kind that came from genuinely not knowing rather than from wanting to demonstrate what she already understood. On the first April morning, she was the one who organized the families arriving at the creek, directing traffic. Gently, in her capable way, making sure the newer learners had space to see and the more experienced ones were positioned where they could help rather than crowd. She did it without being asked and without making it a performance, which was new Marlena, and which suggested that she was capable of doing things differently than she had for 20 years, when the reason to do so was sufficiently clear. Elowen watched this and felt something she didn't entirely have a word for, not vindication, which would have required more self-involvement than she was interested in, and not satisfaction exactly, though it was close to satisfaction. It was more like watching a thing arrive at what it had been moving toward all along, and feeling the rightness of that arrival without needing to take credit for it. She presented at the County Agricultural Society in late April in a meeting room in the county seat that held more people than she'd expected, not just farming families, but men and women from the county administrations then, a newspaper writer with a small notebook, 2 other doctors who'd heard about Lander's letter and were curious. She stood at the front of the room with her samples laid out on the table beside her, and she spoke plainly, without performance, the way she spoke at the creek. Described each plant. She described how to find it, how to identify it, how to prepare it, how to preserve it. She described the autumn in Ash Hollow, not as a story about herself, but as a demonstration of what the knowledge could do when a community was willing to use it. She said, "The land around most of our farms contains food that has been there longer than our farms have, not as a supplement to what we cultivate as a companion to it, a reliable companion that doesn't require planting and doesn't fail the way a cultivated crop can. Fail because it's been adapting to this land for longer than any of us have been farming it. Question is not whether it's there. The question is whether we're willing to see it," she said. "My grandmother knew all of this. Her mother knew it, and her mother's mother knew it. We called it poverty food, or we stopped calling it anything at all and just forgot about it, because we decided we'd moved past the need for it. And then one August a swarm of beetles came through Ash Hollow and reminded us that the land doesn't negotiate, and the seasons don't negotiate, and you either know how to feed yourself from what's available or you don't." She paused. The room was quiet. She said, "What I want to leave you with is not the list of plants, though the list matters. The habit of looking, the habit of walking your land and the land around it, and actually seeing what's there, not what you planted, not what you planned for, what's there. The land is more patient than we are. It keeps offering. Most of the time, we're just not paying attention." She drove home from the county seat with Silas, who had come without being asked and had sat in the back of the room without drawing attention to himself, which was what Silas did when he was proud of something and wanted to witness it without interfering. They drove most of the way home in comfortable quiet, the kind that married people inhabited without effort. Halfway home, he said, "Your grandmother would have liked that. She would have said I talked too long," Elowen said. "Probably," he said, "but she would have liked it." The composition book was published by the Agricultural Society that summer, a plain-covered pamphlet, 40 pages, distributed to farming families across the county. First page said, "Edible Plants of the Valley, a guide for farming families," compiled by Elowen Hartley of Ash Hollow, from knowledge originally held by her grandmother. Nora Caswell, of the hill country, unglamorous. It was exactly what she'd intended. In Ash Hollow, the summer that followed, the hard autumn was quieter than anyone had expected. But not in the way of a community that had been through something and was trying to forget it. It was quieter in the way of a community that had absorbed something into itself and was living differently because of it. The creek bank was visited now, not just by Elowen, but by a dozen families, who came at different times and different frequencies, who knew the plants by name and by sight, and who passed the knowledge between them in the unannounced way that useful knowledge tended to travel when nobody was making a system out of it. Thomas Pierce, who was 8 now and fully recovered and had no memory of being the center of a valley-wide crisis, could identify Lamb's quarters at a distance and had a strong opinion about which preparation method was best that he was willing to share with anyone who asked, and some people who didn't. His mother Clara had preserved more wild plants the previous autumn than any other family in the valley, and she had a particular way with dried nettles that 3 other women had asked her to demonstrate. Bess Rowe, who had been 11 and feeding dried greens to her chickens as a safety test, was 13 now and had a section of creek bank she thought of as hers, not possessively, just attentively, the way you thought of a thing you'd decided to be responsible for. She checked on it the way Elowen had always checked on things, consistently and without announcement, because caring for something was not a performance. When Elowen went back to the creek the following summer, on a morning in July when the light came through the cottonwood leaves in the particular way it came, in July dappled and generous, not the white sky light of winter or the flat light of the hard months, she went alone, the way she'd always gone in the beginning. Both baskets, muddy boots, hair coming loose. She walked the bank she knew by memory, past the places she'd shown to Clara and Dorothea, and Margaret and Vera and Louise and Polly and Gideon and Marlena and a dozen others, past the fallen cottonwood and the nettle patch that Polly had found in a frightened October and pointed her toward. She walked it all, and it looked the way it had always looked, unchanged, undramatic, simply itself. The plants growing in their patterns, the water moving in its direction, bank holding the cool smell of earth and green that she had been walking toward since she was 6 years old. And her grandmother had crouched beside her and started talking, stopped at the bend where she always stopped. She had not needed to become someone else. She had not needed to perform certainty or borrow Omar authority or make herself small so that the valley would accept what she was offering. She had needed to stay at the creek, keep coming back, and keep knowing what she knew, and keep giving it away to whoever was ready to receive it, and trust that the land would keep producing, and the people would eventually keep learning, and the knowledge would keep moving from hand to hand the way knowledge moved when it was real. That was all. And also she understood now. That was not a small thing. That was in its plain and unglamorous way, the whole thing. The Lamb's quarters were growing thick at the water's edge, exactly as they always had. She crouched down and pulled a handful and turned them in her hands, and they smelled the way they always smelled, clean and green and utterly honest. And she put them in the basket and kept moving along the bank, her boots sinking slightly in the soft mud, the morning coming up around her the way it always did, offering what it had.